Do you have hip pain that travels from one area to the next? Maybe it starts in the back of your hip and then moves to the side, and before you know it, it's the front of your hip that's aching. This is a common thing that many people experience, but there are some simple things that you can start implementing within your workouts and outside of your workouts to help manage this. This is exactly what we're discussing on this week's episode of the Exercise is Health podcast. We're going to cue our introduction and we're going to dive right into this conversation. Hey, welcome back, exercisers, to the Exercise is Health podcast, brought to you by Exercise for Life Studios, where we believe that your health is your most valuable asset, and the single best thing that you can do to both boost and protect this asset is exercise. Specifically, exercise is geared towards building the health and function of your muscles. We are your hosts, Charlie
and Julie.
Today we are discussing this idea of traveling hip pain, okay? If you've had it before, you know exactly what we're talking about, and if you're not sure, you likely haven't had it, so let me just explain. This is a pain that happens where it's literally like in the back of your hip or on the side, and then the next day it starts to move more towards the upper part of your of the back of your hip, and then it moves to the front of your hip, and then to the end. It's like all areas of your hip get hit with this different type of pain. It'll be like a dull ache and then something sharp, and it's just constantly fluctuating the type of pain or the area, and it's moving all around, and it can be extremely frustrating to deal with because of the inconsistency of the location, because of the inconsistency of the sensation. So we want to give you something consistent that you can do to try to help strengthen your body and help your body function better.
Absolutely. This is really frustrating for a lot of our clients that we see with traveling hip pain, mostly because I think it's easier in our brains to make sense of typing into Google, how do I work on hip pain that's on the side or hip pain that's in my butt going down my leg. It's like, well, what is even the problem? Well, I think to give you a bigger picture, let's zoom out for a minute and talk about what is happening with the muscles here. So there can be a structural issue happening or not with hip pain, especially one that travels around. Okay, and a structural issue would mean something like arthritis or interference with a nerve, like you have a sciatica thingy, or you have some discs that are influenced. So those are structural changes. But we know whether there's a structural change or not, there is a huge muscular change. There's always the muscular change. So if you're ever feeling discomfort, 100% of the times that Charlie and I have ever worked with clients with discomfort, there's always a contributing and usually very, very, very large contributing factor of the muscle system. And so when we're thinking about the muscles, when you're thinking about traveling hip discomfort, you get a lot of discomfort in areas that are not getting a lot of good muscle support. One of the hugest jobs of the muscle system, we always think of it like, oh, our muscles move us. But the other thing that muscles do is because they contract and pull and squeeze, they are also the supporter of your joints. They're actually the only one highly active supporter of your joints, which means it can change really fast. And so wherever you're having hip discomfort, that's usually where the muscles are not functioning well. Like they're failing to provide the support, which is why it hurts. And when it comes to a joint like the hip is such like a 360 joint that your body is trying to actively figure this problem out. And that's why the pain is traveling. It's not like you're having a new issue and then a new issue and then a new issue and then another new issue. What's happening is that you have an issue going on that hasn't been solved, and now your body is trying to puzzle piece this together. What is the best place? I know this is weird to think. What is the best place or the most advantageous place for me to lack support today? And then tomorrow it might travel around, or you might do a workout and it feels different, or you might get some MAT and it feels different, or you might get a massage and it feels different because you're changing the muscle system. And so why it's traveling is because your body is just trying to solve this problem and it's compensating in a different way, which then leads to you having those different sensations.
Yeah, Julie, you bring up so many good points, okay? The idea being if there's a structural issue going on, let's say there's a fracture of a bone, okay? It's not like the fracture changes positions, over the course of a day or a week or a month. It's not like one part of your bone is broken and then a different part of your bone and then it is. So if it's something structural, that's going to be in that specific spot, that's where the issue is. But when it's something that travels around, like you're saying, Julie, that's a big indicator that the muscles are likely highly involved in what's going on. And just as you're saying, your body, your brain, your neuromuscular system is constantly trying to figure out which muscles are most capable at any given moment. And it can change things so quickly as far as like, well, we're going to start using these muscles more. Oh, we need to back off. We need to start using these muscles more. Oh, we need to back off. We need to use these muscles. And every time it makes a change like that to try to compensate around an issue that's going on, the sensation is going to be a little bit different. Certain areas are going to feel a little bit more worked. Certain areas are going to feel a little bit more comfortable. Certain areas are going to feel a little bit tighter. And so when the sensation is changing position, is literally like traveling around or bouncing around, that for us is a huge indicator that something is going on with your muscles. And the great news about it being something going on with your muscles is there are so many things that you can do to help improve the strength and the function of your muscles. And that's exactly what we want to lay out for you today.
That's right. And so if you are listening to this and you're like, usually once people experience MAT, actually they're very like, wow, yeah, it really was the muscles the whole time. But usually when you're in the heat of the symptoms, it's very hard to fathom that the solution could be in your muscle system, honestly, because you haven't yet had an experience where you changed your muscles and it then fixed your problem. So let me back this up a minute too, because there's two things that your muscles are going to do for you, whether you feel it's going to solve your issue or not. Number one, your muscles, again, are the supporter of your joints. There is nothing else in your body that is an active supporter. Everything else is a passive supporter. And so we're going to talk about some exercise things that we suggest you do, and we see change our clients' bodies all the time. But number one, by keeping your muscles in the best shape that they can, is going to support the achy joint, whatever joint it is. Today we're talking about the hip, the best that it possibly can with active support, rather than relying on passive structures like ligaments or your labrum or other things like that. The second thing is that because the muscles provide support, the fastest and best way for any damage that has happened to your hip to heal is to get stress off of that joint, right? So if you do have, something going on with your labrum and you're like, well, it's a labrum thing, Julie and Charlie, it's not a muscle thing. Well, the only way to get stress off that labrum so that it can heal, it has the opportunity to heal, it's in an environment of healing, is to give that joint support. And because right now, the way that it's functioning is harassing that area. It's stressing out that area, that labrum, that tendon, that ligament, whatever you feel like is happening that's not muscular. So the two main reasons why we know that muscles are a huge facilitator for healing and feeling better and feeling more pain-free, feeling more free in your body, is that number one, you're providing support to the joint that's struggling. Hands down, that will happen. Number two is that you're allowing a healing environment, a less stressful environment, a more balanced environment for any structures that may be taking on a big part of this stress.
Absolutely. So how do we go about doing this? Well, we have 3 steps that we want you to follow to help not only your hips get stronger, but also make sure the rest of your body gets stronger and stays functioning well as well. Okay. So the first step is to keep up the conditioning and keep up the strength with the pain-free areas of your body. Okay. So if it's your hip that's bugging you and it's like, okay, the front of my hip and then the outside of my hip and then, the back of my hip, everything like that. Okay. Make sure you're keeping up the strength of the other hip. Make sure you're keeping up the strength of the muscles that control your knees. Make sure you're keeping up the strength of the muscles that control your trunk, your core, your low back, your shoulders, all the other areas of your body. Too often what we see is people are symptomatic in one area of their body, and that stops them from keeping up the strength and conditioning throughout the entire rest of their body, which means when they actually go and try to address the area that is symptomatic, they are approaching it with a body that's weaker, that's more deconditioned overall, which just makes it more difficult to recover faster from the symptomatic area. So by keeping up the strength, by keeping up the function, by keeping up conditioning throughout the rest of your system, you will have a much more able system to then go and help the area that is symptomatic with the hip recover faster.
Charlie, this is a huge one, and this one happens all the time, especially when you feel like you have something that literally puts you in the category of rehab-ish, right? Like maybe you're not going to like a rehab type place, but you're like, wow, this is like really out of service. My hip is like not doing so hot. And the conditioning of the rest of your body just tanks because you feel like one area means that everything else has to struggle. So what you said was totally right. You got to keep up the strength of everything that's feeling great. And then if you feel good with it, and this is going to slowly take us into step 2, is going to be keeping up the strength where you can in the struggling joint, in the hip that has the traveling hip pain. So for example, if you are doing, a great hip exercise would be like a leg press. If your leg press feels asymptomatic, it feels good when you do it, then do it and keep that challenge high. Keep it high as long as it's symptom-free. And then as you keep exploring the hip motions, let's say you go to hip abduction and that one's not feeling so hot. That's when you're going to start navigating through the areas that are still less than ideal. Okay, so just because you have, like you've labeled in your head, my hip has a problem, it doesn't mean that every hip motion has a problem. So we want you to identify the hip motions that feel great and keep challenging those because you want to, again, keep the conditioning up of those muscles and keep the function of those muscles high. And don't just leave them out because you're like, oh, well, this is a hip exercise. I have a hip problem, so I just don't do it. So the ones that feel good, the ones that are asymptomatic, keep doing it. The ones that you're having to carefully navigate, that's when you definitely need to focus in on your 4 Exercise for Life principles. We recommend that all the time you use the 4 Exercise for Life principles, whether things feel great or don't feel great. But the Exercise for Life principles are the way that you're going to be able to navigate the less than ideal ranges so that you can keep up and start working on the function of these muscles that need to start providing support to your joint and need to start providing that healing environment for any areas that are getting stressed out.
Absolutely. So as a quick recap, the 4 Exercise for Life principles are: number 1, use your pain-free, symptom-free range of motion. And specifically for this topic, this first Exercise for Life principle is going to be huge. So going back to the example you gave, Julie, where the hip abduction or kind of pushing the legs apart doesn't feel that great for the hip, you ask yourself, okay, is it the entire motion that doesn't feel great? Or are there parts of the motion that are more symptomatic and parts of the motion that are less symptomatic? Okay, what you would do is you stay within the parts that are less symptomatic. You don't go into the parts of the range that are creating more symptoms, that are intensifying the symptoms. You are staying in the parts of the range that either the symptoms are staying the same or they are relatively asymptomatic. Okay, you do your exercise within that part of the range. And you might be thinking, but what's that even going to do? Because I'm not using full range of motion. What it's doing is it's getting your muscles stronger in the areas where your body says, yeah, this is less of a threat to do this range of motion here, okay? And as you build the strength through the parts of your body that through the parts of the motion that your body feels less threatened by, your body will start to allow you to have more and more and more range of motion and be less threatened by that range of motion, okay? So if you are feeling more symptomatic as you do, a range of motion, stay in the parts where you are less symptomatic. So that is a first Exercise for Life principle. That really is the big one with this. The other 3 are super important as well, but when we're talking about like navigating through a less than ideal range of motion or a less than full range of motion, all right, making sure you are really locking in on doing the exercise in the area that is less symptomatic or symptom-free, stretch-free, pain-free, pinchy-free, as close to that as possible. That is going to be the key to making sure you continue to build the strength and function of the hip area.
That's right. More often than not, we find that when an area, especially your hip, feels out of service, we just want to let it rest, right? We're like, don't you think I should just let it rest? It's hurting me. And there is some value to allowing an area and tissues to heal via rest. But we do know that resting often just calms down the flare-up, right? And it doesn't actually get to the issue why it was caused, which leads to people like continuing to do the same stuff. Like, oh, I have a hip issue, and then it just recurs throughout my life because the issue, the imbalance in the muscle system and the support from the muscle system is never addressed. So really approaching these more careful areas with this type of mentality of saying, hey, this range of motion seems pretty off limits to me, but this small portion of the motion I can do, and I can start building strength. And that's really the only way to teach your body how to regain strength in that range. It's not from resting, because that won't reteach your body, hey, how do we start building strength and building almost like resiliency. Strength means resiliency, right? It's still vulnerable if you're not strengthening it. So again, number one, identify the areas that aren't painful and the ranges that aren't painful. Keep up the big strength and conditioning in those areas. And then the areas that are an issue, the ranges that you're testing and you're like, ugh, those just don't feel so hot. That definitely feels like my issue. You're going to stay within your symptom-free, pain-free, stretch-free range of motion and apply all 4 Exercise for Life principles so that you could start making an impact on this very vulnerable motion in a really smart, productive way.
Absolutely. So, and then we're just going to cover quickly the other 3 Exercise for Life principles before getting to step number 3. So again, principle number 1 was to use your symptom-free full range of motion. Principle number 2 is to control your moving and non-moving segments. Principle number 3 is to move slowly. And principle number 4 is to focus on squeezing your muscles. Those other 3 principles we have covered in depth within other podcasts, as well as a lot of our content on social media. So you can definitely check that out if you would like a more kind of in-depth approach or understanding of those 3 Exercise for Life principles. They are also something that we cover very in depth within every single workout of the Exercise for Life membership. Step number 3 of this process is to make sure your muscles are functioning well throughout your entire body, not just your hip, but your core, around your knees, your feet, okay, with muscle activation techniques. So often when there is a symptom within our system, because of how highly influential the muscle system is at supporting and controlling our structure, at being able to change how it's being used just based on how our body's doing at a given moment, making sure that your muscles are functioning as well as they can using the MAT process can have a huge influence over what you are experiencing from a traveling hip pain perspective. This is something that we see time and time again with clients, whether they have a known structural issue or not. If they have this traveling pain going on where it's one area of their hip is bothering them at one moment, and then a day or a different period of time it's another area of the hip, something like that. Again, that is a clear indicator that the muscles are likely highly involved in what they are experiencing, and making sure their muscles are working well and supporting the hip joint and all the passive structures of the hip is crucial to helping their hip feel better, but also making sure that they're able to keep doing all the things that they want to do.
Yeah, MAT is really the specific deep dive in investigating what's going on. You definitely know you're going to need MAT is if you're doing step 2, which means that you're carefully working through the motions that are symptomatic or problematic. And if every time you show up to do your exercises, it just improves, then great. The problem there was probably that the muscle just needed the right amount of stimulus from your exercise. And that's great. You just solved your issue, and then you just keep building and building and building. But if every time you come back and you're back to square one, or you're not noticing that as you continue to carefully work through the range of motion, your range isn't changing, your symptoms aren't changing, that's a good sign that you might have more of a neuromuscular issue rather than just a conditioning strength issue. And so MAT will do that deep dive in looking into what muscles is your brain even struggling to connect to, and so they're just not being able to participate when you go and exercise. MAT tries to make sure that all muscles are on board so that when you go into your exercise, they're all ready to be strengthened.
Absolutely. So if you're in the Chicagoland area and you would like your body assessed with muscle activation techniques, figure out where you have muscles within your system that aren't working as well as they should, you can schedule your assessment with us by going to matschaumburg.com. There's a big green button that says schedule now, get started, all the above. You just click that and just find whatever time spot works for you within our calendar. And if you'd like our guidance implementing the 4 Exercise for Life principles within your workouts to make sure that your focus stays on building the strength and function of your muscles while minimizing the stress and the negative repercussions that can happen to the joints and the rest of the body, it's exactly what we teach you within the Exercise for Life membership. Right now, you can get 30 days access to the entire membership for free by going to www.exerciseforlifestudios.com. So who do you know that needs to hear this episode? Who do you know that has some traveling hip pain that they've been battling for a while and does not seem to be getting better? Share this episode with them so they can understand 3 steps that they can take to start helping it improve and helping the strength and function of their muscles improve to help support the healing of their hip. And while you're online, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to us and leave us a rating and review. It helps people find our podcast when they're looking for information on exercise and they're looking for information on health. So if you found value in this conversation today, let us know by leaving us a 5-star rating and review. Well, thanks so much for tuning in. We always appreciate it. Have a fantastic week, and we'll talk with you all next week.
This podcast is for information purposes only. The statements and views on this podcast are not medical advice. This podcast, including Julie and Charlie Gates, disclaim responsibility for any possible adverse effects from the use of information contained herein. Opinions of guests are their own, and this podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about guest qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements or advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have a direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. If you think you have a medical issue, consult a licensed physician.